Is South Africa's manufacturing competitive, and could it be more so? What do we need to do to make it more competitive? With us now is international trade expert Peter Draper. Peter, welcome. What's your view on this? Are we competitive?
I think in certain niches we are, but they're relatively small. Overall, I would say the sector is not. There's a whole lot of reasons for that. But if I were to use an old-fashioned theory, the theory of comparative advantage, I would say manufacturing is not our comparative advantage.
We have seen it decline in recent years, have we not, as a share of our economy?
It has. Other sectors have grown, relatively speaking, services in particular, things like finance, communications especially. And the sector has shrunk for sure, and in certain labour-intensive niches particularly, such as clothing. So it's a sector that's been on strain for some time for a whole range of reasons, most of which have to do with the lack of comparative advantage, but also shooting ourselves in the foot on a range of policy issues.
Give me some examples.
Well, electricity supply is the most obvious one, the cost of it, when you can get it, so electricity rationing, I suppose. Labour regulations, that's a big area of concern for manufacturers. Efficiencies in our ports, if you want to manufacture you have to import as well as export, and that has to go through the ports, your logistics infrastructure, all of that. We have serious challenges, I think.
So to turn it around, we'd simply have to reverse those negatives that you've mentioned?
Well, no, because it's a function of comparative advantage. So if you're talking manufacturing, who are you competing against? So we're competing against China, most obviously. And that pretty much excludes a low-wage, labour-intensive, assembly-based manufacturing industry, which is bad news for the many unemployed people in our economy. But if you're talking high-tech, research-intensive, technology-intensive, then you're competing with the Germans, the Europeans, the Americans, and that's a very difficult game to get into. So we're kind of squeezed in between, I suppose.
Between a rock and a hard place.
Between a rock and a hard place. So for me, it's about finding the niches. It's about plugging into global value chains, about getting the multinationals in here, plugging into their supply chains, and figuring out how to do that.
And how do we compare with the rest of Africa?
Well, obviously we have a quite diversified manufacturing sector. There's not much going on in terms of manufacturing elsewhere. A few exceptions. Kenya, there's something happening. Kenya exports a lot of manufactured goods into its immediate region, especially in East Africa. And Nigeria has a lot of latent advantages that we don't, but for all sorts of reasons doesn't capitalize on them. And again, those are largely self-inflicted, domestic institutional issues as well as policy issues.
Nigeria, of course, has just rebased its economy. It's now the biggest in Africa. Symbolically very important, but does that impact on an area like manufacturing?
I think it's certainly their intention to grow the manufacturing sector. The reality is it's really still an oil-based economy, with a lot of services growing around that, and that's important. Agriculture is also important to them, could be doing a lot better. But with their huge labour force, potentially in this low-wage, assembly-based manufacturing game, they have a real comparative advantage. But they have to sort their ports out, they have to get electricity infrastructure in place, human resource development, all of that. Those are main huge challenges in Nigeria and elsewhere on the continent.
So the low-cost manufacturers in the Far East are not losing sleep about Africa's challenge at the moment?
Not just yet, but in the World Economic Forum we've done some interesting work on this, and I think there's something of a consensus. The World Bank and others have looked at this, that, well, the number is 80 million jobs will be offshored out of China in the next 10 years because of the rising China cost. That's got a long way to run, obviously, but 80 million jobs, where are they going to go? Well, certainly in the first instance into other parts of Asia. So we're seeing manufacturing taking off in Vietnam particularly, Cambodia, Bangladesh. But 10 to 15 years down the line, why not in Nigeria? Coastal location, big labour force. If it can get the institutional story right, which is a big if, admittedly, then why not?
The institutional story would include education, and that's a problem we have here.
Yes, absolutely. So I guess the logic of competing in global value chains is all about making yourself attractive to multinational companies. So what do multinationals want? Well, they want a good workforce, that's clear. a lot of the competition between global value chains is essentially about human resource competition. So they want access to those good resources. But it goes much further than that. They want strong intellectual property rights. They want to know their technology is going to be protected, for instance. They want good logistics infrastructure, good services infrastructure that supports that. So there's a whole lot of things you have to put in place. It's not an easy game, but a lot of that is horizontal. It cuts across the economy. It's not about picking winners, if you like, the old-style industrial policy.
So South Africa and Africa has a long way to go still. Peter Draper, thank you for being with us.